Focusing on the active Latin American participation in World War II, I would like to know more about Mexico's involvement, especially about the Aztec Eagles, and about the large number of Mexican volunteers who fought in the United States Army. Well, we've never specifically talked about Mexico in World War II here on the channel, and maybe this is a good way to start, right, to bring up the subject. Very well. How did Mexico participate in World War II? It's interesting that Mexico had such an active diplomatic role regarding the events that led to World War II back in the 1930s, right? So that sequence of rather bold actions, let's put it that way, right? Crossing the borders of other states, whether by Germany, Italy, or the Soviet Union, were all condemned by Mexico. Clearly, right? Officially, they were condemned by Mexico. While other European nations, like England and France themselves, in many of these cases just sat back quietly and did nothing, right? So Mexican diplomacy was active in the 1930s. It really protested against that growing tension in Europe. In fact, we can't even say that Mexico was only anti-Axis, because in 1938, due to disputes over oil production and distribution, Mexico broke diplomatic relations with England. I mean, the United Kingdom, right? It broke diplomatic relations with the United Kingdom. So it was a country that really had a bold diplomacy, right? Very unique. Well, the war starts in September of '39 over in Europe, and Mexico declares itself neutral. Just like Brazil, right? Declares itself neutral. I'm neutral. I don't want to take sides with either A or B, right? The one who makes that decision at the time is the president of Mexico, Lázaro Cárdenas, right? Lázaro Cárdenas decides that Mexico will be a neutral power and will keep trading with the Germans, the Italians, the Americans, and the French, right? But this situation starts to change in 1940. With the Atlantic blockade by the Royal Navy, right? Many Italian and German ships were stranded in Mexican ports, and because of Mexico's neutral stance up to that point, right, the Germans and Italians felt in a way comfortable leaving those ships there. But in December 1940, the presidency of Mexico was going to change. There would be elections there, and the presidency of Mexico would change. And the one who would take over the presidency of Mexico would be a reserve general named Manuel Camacho. And Manuel Camacho is already a pro-Allies guy, right? He's already pro-American. And Manuel Camacho then starts to clearly realize that there's not much hope for the Germans and Italians on the other side of the Atlantic, right? So Mexican trade, the sale of oil, will only really be possible with the United States. So he starts to align himself much more closely with the Americans than his predecessors ever did. Remember that Mexico had a pretty serious history of border conflicts with the United States at the beginning of the 20th century, okay? Up until that time, you could say. And Franklin Roosevelt, the American president, changed that big stick doctrine, right, to the good neighbor policy. In other words, Roosevelt wanted to get closer to the Latin American countries through demonstrations of goodwill during World War II to bring these countries closer to the American cause. And there's an even clearer factor, right? A more tangible factor is this. In 1940, especially after the fall of France in June, the American industry shifted onto a war footing, initially to supply war materials to the Allies, right? Which at that time were only China and England. And they also started thinking about the country's own involvement in the conflict. So the American war industry started to grow in a very obvious way. And for that, the American industry needs Mexican raw materials. Oil is the main one of these raw materials, okay? So what's going to happen? In December 1941, the United States was attacked in the Pacific, right? At Pearl Harbor in Hawaii by the Empire of Japan. And the Mexican president, Camacho, he then decides to fulfill everything that was diplomatically established at the Havana Conference in 1940 and breaks diplomatic relations with the three Axis countries, right? Japan, Germany, and Italy. He breaks diplomatic relations. In this, Mexico is the first in Latin America to do this, because you know that Brazil will only hold the Rio de Janeiro conference at the end of the conference. The Rio de Janeiro conference, held in January 1942, is the event that will break diplomatic relations. So Mexico does this almost automatically, still in December 1941. From that moment on, then, without diplomatic relations, Mexico first, it seizes and expropriates those Italian and German ships that were in its ports, right? And it's curious that among those Italian ships, there was an oil tanker called Lucifero, which will be nationalized by the Mexicans, right? And in May 1942, I believe, on May 13, 1942, that same nationalized Italian oil tanker will be torpedoed by a German submarine. And that torpedo attack will lead to a massive explosion there, right, of the oil tanker's cargo. And it will lead to a rise in tension, major tensions between Camacho and Germany. He asks for an explanation of that attack, right? And he doesn't get anything. And on the 20th, right, 7 days later, on May 20th, another oil tanker is sunk by a U-boat. So these two oil tankers, sunk within a week, will make the Mexican Congress declare war on the Axis countries, right? Interestingly, unlike Brazil, which declared war on Germany and Italy, but not Japan, Mexico declares war on Germany, Italy, and Japan, right? So the Mexicans will lose 4 more ships in the following months or weeks. Those 4 ships were also carrying oil. And despite this continuation of German actions, right, which I've already explained in other videos, that will probably revolve around the same level, the same set of decisions that led the Germans to attack the Brazilians. In other words, if these countries no longer have diplomatic relations with us, we can consider them enemies, right? Because they are supplying war materials to the United States. So the same German directive drives their actions against Mexico and Brazil just a few months apart in the same year of 1942. So we see that even with Mexico's involvement 3 months before Brazil, in World War II, Mexico doesn't plan to send troops abroad. They don't make any clear plans, right? They don't really plan to send troops abroad. Mexico makes it clear that its contribution to the war will be solely material support and the defense of its own territory to prevent Axis actions there. In fact, the Americans try to convince the Mexican government to establish a base in Baja California, right? In Baja California, which is that Mexican province on the Pacific located below California, right? And then the Mexican government rejects it and says it will reinforce the coastal garrison in that area, okay? So what do we see? In the year 1943, in April 1943, so right after the Roosevelt visits Vargas, right, and also holds the Casablanca Conference and visits Vargas in Natal. Here in Brazil, he goes to Mexico. In April, he goes to Mexico and visits President Camacho there in Monterrey. And there they start talking about sending Mexican troops abroad. And Mexico, after really a lot of consideration, it was almost a year of consideration.
É,
It was agreed that Mexico would send a combat unit abroad. However, the Mexicans want to fight in a Spanish-speaking country. As you know, Spain is neutral in Europe, so the Mexicans avoid involvement in the European theater. So they go to the Pacific. And the expectation was that the Mexicans would help with the liberation of the Philippines, which is a country with Hispanic heritage, right? Just like Mexico is. So the population, to a large extent, still speaks Spanish there in the Philippines. And so it was decided that the air component, which would be the smallest possible, a fighter squadron, would be formed. And this fighter squadron, which is the 201st Fighter Squadron, ended up being formed, right, officially in July 1944. Just reminding you that the Centapua had already been created back in December 1943. And at that point, the Brazilian pilots were already in the United States finishing their training. That's when the Mexican squadron was created, right? The Mexican squadron would also fly the P-47D just like the Brazilians did, but on the other side of the world, right? It's also worth remembering that Camacho's approach to the United States, especially from 1941 onwards, is also reflected in American investments in Mexico, including with the signing of the Lend-Lease by Mexico, which then favored the modernization of the Mexican armed forces. In this case, then, the deployment of a fighter squadron abroad to really gain real combat experience would be something beneficial for the country's armed forces. Yeah, we see that sending only a single fighter squadron is also a reflection of the low public support. Low, yes, right? Let's see. It's not that low, but it's not the majority. Public support among Mexicans for a Mexican intervention abroad. Only 40% of the Mexican population approved sending Mexican troops abroad. Whereas here in Brazil, the majority approved, right? The Brazilian involvement abroad, right? In order to avenge the attacks of August 1942. So what is going to happen? These P-47 pilots, about 35 in all, and their ground crew, who are also volunteers, right? Just like Santa Apua, the Mexican squadron is also a volunteer squadron. They will be transferred to the United States and will start receiving training there. With the arrival of winter, they were in Idaho. They are moved to an airfield, an air base in Greenville, Texas. And there in Texas, they will receive their final phase of training and will be declared fit for flight. In February 1945, in the month of March, the following month, these pilots from Squadron 201, they will be sent by ship from California to Luzon in the Philippines, which was already under attack at that time. And they will be stationed in March. They will arrive there at the end of March, and they will be stationed at Clark Field, which is the main airfield, the main American air base in the Philippines, right? It was already like that before the war, and it continued to be afterwards as well. So, as you can see there in the Philippines, the Mexican pilots, right, and the ground crew will slowly start getting used to that rhythm of war, right, to modern warfare as practiced by the Americans. Initially, they will use P-47s borrowed from other squadrons to be able to fly their first missions. And it's that same arrangement that Centapua used in Italy, right? It's putting a pilot among 3 American pilots, putting a Mexican pilot among 3 American pilots to get the guy used to it, to fly combat missions and make him understand what the reality of war is. Because you don't want to put 4 Mexicans, just like you wouldn't want to put 4 Brazilians alone, inexperienced, completely inexperienced, going into a war situation for the first time. So you make this introduction, right? A very, very gradual introduction of these rookie pilots to a combat environment. Then, man, The Mexicans will finally receive their first P-47s of their own at the end of May. And then, to avoid any kind of confusion with the American anti-aircraft artillery in the Philippines, unfortunately, they're going to use American insignias, which you can see here, painted on. On the rear fuselage of the plane, the American star, and also here on the right wing, the American star. They are going to use the Mexican national insignia, which are these concentric triangles here on the underside of the left wing. And on the rudder, they are going to use the Mexican colors, only here on the rudder, right? But for identification purposes, to make it clear so no one confuses them with enemies, they use the American insignia on the fuselage in a very large size, right? So what happens next? The Mexicans start their first real combat missions as a squadron only in June 1945. And it's interesting because that's a month after Sanapua ended, right? After Sanapua ended its combat missions in Italy, the Mexicans would enter combat in the Pacific. And over there in the Pacific then, they will carry out several interdiction missions. You can see here, look, bombs under the wings of the P-47s, and this explosion here on the ground, which most likely depicts northern Luzon, which was still under the command of the 14th Japanese Army led by General Tomoyuki Yamashita, whom I already mentioned. Here on the channel, I covered the full biography of General Tomoyuki Yamashita, right? So guys, the Mexicans, they will also carry out several attack missions against targets in Taiwan, which at the time was known as Formosa, right? Called Formosa, which involved a long journey over the Pacific to Taiwan. And these journeys ended up claiming the lives of some pilots, right? Because the P-47 wasn't really considered an aircraft with such a long range. So about two, if I'm not mistaken, 2 or 3 Mexican pilots ended up crashing into the sea due to lack of fuel on these missions against Taiwan and died there. Okay? So we have a Mexican pilot who crashed into a mountain and another Mexican pilot who was shot down by a Japanese fighter. Okay? Shot down by a Japanese fighter. And others who fell into the sea due to lack of fuel. In total, there were 5 combat casualties and another 3 casualties during training. So that's 8 fatalities. Yeah, that the Mexicans had. And if we compare it, right, with the Brazilian squadron, we had 9 fatal casualties in the Brazilian squadron, but including Gastaldoni, who died while still in training in Panama, not in the theater of operations. So, with the dropping of the atomic bombs in August of 45 there in Japan, the war ended, and Mexican participation also came to an end. They flew about 90 missions in total. Yeah, that's a much smaller number than the number of missions flown by Sanapua, right? So it's a squadron that had just a fraction of the time in action compared to the Brazilian squadron, right? The Mexicans really were like the last ones. Really, the last new addition in World War II was the Mexican squadron, which only entered combat in June of 45, up in the north of the Philippines, right? But then, as Fred also asked, there were many Mexican volunteers who fought alongside the Allied armed forces. And these Mexican volunteers, they fought not only with the American armed forces, but also with the British armed forces, right? Many volunteers, let's say children of Mexican immigrants who were born in British territory in some British colony, ended up volunteering for service together with the British Army, with the British armed forces as a whole. And the same thing happened, right? Many Mexicans who moved to the United States crossed the border ended up being recruited into the United States Armed Forces and fought with the United States Armed Forces. The number of Mexicans who fought voluntarily abroad is between 50,000 and 80,000. Between 50,000 and 80,000 Mexicans volunteered for this. And so the most outstanding among them is this guy right here, Sergeant José López. Okay, José López, born in Oaxaca, Mexico. He became an orphan when he was still very young, right? And he had an uncle who lived in Texas. And then since he became an orphan, the uncle said, so bring the boy here, let him come live with me. And he went there. And there he grew up and became, a boxer, right? He started to, I don't know if the guy liked to get into street fights, but there was a manager who noticed his talent as a boxer and turned him into a featherweight star, right? So he actually made some money as a boxer in the late 1930s. And he volunteered for service with the merchant marine López, right? And in 1942 then, López received the draft notice for service in the Army. And the guy then was assigned to the 2nd Infantry Division and was sent to Europe. There in Europe then, López, on December 17, 1944, stationed at the front line, right at the forefront of the American advance in the Ardennes, in southern Belgium, López. He realized that his company, Company K, right? Within the 2nd Infantry Division, the company was at risk of being surrounded by the German advance. Then, this guy grabbed a machine gun and went ahead of the company and started sweeping the area in front of the company with fire at the advancing Germans, right? The German combat groups that were advancing. And he alone kept shooting here, changing position, shooting there, changing position, shooting over there. He managed to stop the German advance in front of the company, allowing the company to successfully retreat and not be completely surrounded and captured. And then José López ended up being awarded the Medal of Honor. You can see López there, Sergeant José López, being awarded the Medal of Honor. Right here, look, around his neck there. And without a doubt, Sergeant José López was the most decorated Mexican-born soldier of World War II. So, if you liked our answer and want to learn a little more about military history, buy my book here, O Átomo como Arma, which will tell you various secrets about the creation, development, and use of the atomic bomb in World War II. Check out this really cool artwork on the back cover and on the front as well. This book is for sale at the WWII store right here, in the link in the description and also in the QR code on the screen. You can buy it there. But also, if you want this book here with a dedication for you, which I'll autograph for you, just send an email to saladeguerra@gmail.com with your zip code so I can calculate the shipping.